Hey there, John.
Howdy, Ryan.
All right, and we're continuing on with our discussion of leverage points, places to intervene in a system by Donella Meadows. So this brings us to point number 9, which is the length of delays in a system relative to the rate of system change. Um, and this follows kind of what we had considered the first three, the initial three that are kind of like a set that deal with like the material aspects of the system. And now we start transitioning over into a little bit more of an information focus with this. And so the title for this leverage point is the structure of material stocks and flows and nodes. Oh, sorry, I'm reading the wrong one. The length of delays relative to the rate of system changes. And so, just I guess as a quick reminder for the bathtub analogy, right? We have like the state of the system. So that's all the stuff that all the components that make up a system, right? And you have inflows, things that are entering the system. You have outflows, things that are going out of the system. So things that are being used up, things that are being made and put into the system. And then outside of that, you have the perceived state of the system, right? So what do we think about the system? And finally, there's discrepancies, right? So based on how we desire the system to look, we can change either the inflows or the outflows in order to make the system, the state of the system, more closely resemble what we want it to look like, right? So that perceived state of the system, where we think it is, will give us some idea of what the discrepancy is between the system and our goal for the system, and that will cause us to change either the inflows or the outflows. And so this length of delay really is once there is a discrepancy that's noticed within or by the system, then how long does it take for the system to change to match that discrepancy, or to adjust for that discrepancy?
Yeah, it's really now about that information,
Yep.
the delay in the information, basically of this that you're getting feedback from things. She gives an example of in one of the earlier ones she talked about like the bathtub on the fourth floor and the water heater being in the basement, but she actually talks about a shower that she experienced that was basically that. But basically, from the time she twisted the knob in any direction, there was about like a minute delay before there was like a noticeable change in the water. So if it was, getting a little cold, well, she had to turn the knob, but then she would take like a minute before, the water temperature would adjust. And of course, she might have like overcorrected it. And then, maybe then it was back to being too hot. And then she had to twist back with the cold, but then wait another minute. And then, so basically, that the delay in this information, she says, become critical determinants of system behavior. Then they cause these like oscillations. And,
Yep.
her example between the hot and cold water, obviously, with other things in the system, you could have different oscillations with just about anything depending on what it is. She says if you're trying to adjust a system state to your goal, but you only receive delayed information about what the system state is, you will overshoot and undershoot. Same if your information is timely, but your response isn't. So even if perhaps she, had turned the water and it instantly, or if there was no real delay in like, the water getting hotter or colder, but if her response was then delayed, it would also have the same effect of, having a difficult time actually dialing this desired, thing in. Um, she also gives some great examples here about like it takes a long time to build like an electric power plant.
Right.
And then I guess on average, and maybe I don't know if this is just all types of plants. Maybe it probably depends on the type of plant. If it's like nuclear or coal or whatever the varying cases might have been. But she said roughly, I guess, like a power plant will last for like 30 years, like once it's like up and running. But the fact that it takes so long to build means that, uh, if you need more energy all of a sudden now, well, you can't just put up a new power plant overnight. So there's going to be like a delay. So you have to, a lot of it has to do with like projections, right? But then you might go through some periods where perhaps you have like an excess of energy, or then periods where you have like, too little energy.
Right.
And she says that basically every electrical industry in the world pretty much experiences long oscillations between over and under capacity.
Right,
So
right.
basically, it's just a very difficult thing to dial in because of the delay and the time that it takes to build like a new power plant. You can't just immediately go, oh, we need so many X number of gigawatts more power and then solve that problem immediately. So that's makes sense why that would be a difficult thing to dial in.
Right, right, and I like that power plant example because there's kind of two delays, right, which speak to again like the title of this leverage point that she gives it, which again the title is the length of delays relative to the rate of system changes, right? So there's two delays, which is like the information aspect, which is how much power do we need right now at this moment in time, right? And that's relatively instantaneous. It's probably not like that if you're running the United Kingdom that exactly at any point in time how much power you need, but you have like a general idea as the average amount of like daily output that's required to power everything you want to power, right? So that's pretty instantaneous.
And you probably, would you say too, you probably have some knowledge of like the max and the minimum as well, like if like what your highest capacity that you might need if for some reason like there was an emergency or something occurred. So you might also know like, because obviously you kind of need to have more power available on hand than just the average, because obviously if the average for a day or two happens to spike, then like does the whole system crash? Like you have to have, obviously in some idea, it feels like you need to have some amount of surplus
right
energy,
you
like
don't
baked
want to
into the system.
Yeah, exactly. And most of our power, I guess you kind of you definitely want to bake in some amount of headspace, right, between like what your average amount is and what you could max out at. But there's frequently like a cause for like brownouts during like the summer when like if you have a really hot summer, one of the dog days of summer,
Right.
and you assume as like we go further into climate change, this could become even warmer days could add additional stress to our energy demands.
Right.
Wherein like you probably wouldn't plan for the in New York for 110-degree day, right? But that could happen within the realm of possibility, right? And that the use of air conditioning in all the buildings within the New York metro area is then going to tax above and beyond what you probably allotted for in terms of like energy capacity, even if you were being a little bit more conservative or planning for extra capacity, right?
Right.
So there's gonna be like black swan events that like you can't really plan for. But yeah, you have like a decent idea as to like how much in general you'll need and throw like 10% on top of that or something like that. I don't know, I'm not in charge of power plants. But I'm sure they have some sort of way to figure out what additional capacity they need. So, but that information, right, it takes some amount of time for you to know how much you need. But then the system change is, well, how do we go from having that information, right? Which there's some like small amount of delay for. But then how do we go from having that information to then implementing a change to the system so that we have adjusted to that discrepancy that we found with that information, right? And that's like a much longer period of time. And so you got like the information,
Yeah,
the
she
delay.
says several years, right?
Right. Yeah. It's going to take a lengthy amount of time to construct something like a power plant. And so there's a delay in getting the information, but there's the delay in adjusting the system to accommodate that discrepancy that you determined,
The new information.
Right? Yeah. And since most systems, again, are made of physical material, components, again, that's always going to be harder to construct and build out than gains in information.
Right. Yeah. Especially in today's era, right, where information often travels so quickly.
Yeah.
Like, because obviously, and if you want to think historically, that would have been a massive delay, right? Just getting the information would have taken a long ass time because, like, if people are traveling by horse primarily or whatever, like there would have been a necessary limitation on how much information could travel over vast distances. You know, that's why, you know, one of the most successful empires actually in the ancient world was the Persians, and part of that was because they had this incredible system of like signals and relays of like not only horse riders but also like fire signals and things that could like basically transmit messages across like hundreds of miles within like actually an astonishingly like fast time. That you could like basically they could get information about what was like happening out at the fringe within like a couple of days. Like it's like wild, like for like what they were able to achieve
Yeah, yeah.
with these like relay systems and basically having like these horse rider stations all along. So like somebody would haul ass on a horse to that station, and then the next guy would immediately be able to would jump on a fresh horse and immediately. So like basically like riders and horses were like ready to go at each spot, so that there was like no turnaround and delay for like when the message arrived, and then when it was like they handed it off, somebody jumped on a new horse.
Right, right. It's top
so, like,
efficiency for the materials they're working with.
Exactly. But like obviously today, you know, it's gonna be. I mean, shit, it can be almost instantly, right? I mean, a telephone call or whatever, you know, can inform somebody about what something. You know, I mean, like President Bush was informed about 9/11 within like, you know, a minute or two of the towers, you know, being struck, right? So like now it's often that we get the information a lot quicker, but there are still you still can't build a new power plant instantly. There's still like, you know, she says like several years to, I don't exactly know what that means, but maybe 3, 4, 5 or something to get a new, you know, big power plant up and running. So there's still, even if we do get this better, we have better information in real time, there still are just going to be these inherent delays before we can actually make these like adjustments to the system. She also says that in her view, this is why I like the massive central planning of something like the Soviet Union. She also includes like General Motors, interestingly, because obviously that's like a corporation and normally considered to be a part of like the free market system, which I get the idea she views more favorably for sure. But apparently, I guess, I wonder if she would almost say or would have said something like any organization of a sufficient size with like centralized planning, that basically there become like issues with that just because of like, I guess, the bureaucracy or, you know, the delays in, you know, getting the information and then discussing perhaps what should be done about it, and then, you know, trying to implement a solution, which again, some of these solutions, regardless of like, you know, capitalist or rather economic structure of the system, you know, it doesn't really matter if you have a centrally planned economy or a free market economy. Like a new power plant still requires some amount of time to build. Right. So they're always like, regardless even of like kind of your framework of like how the whole system is structured, there still are just always going to be certain activities that take some amount of time to perform. So it's not like that you know, necessarily one system or another is going to somehow be able to speed up that side of it. If they're just, this is how long it takes to build something new, that's how long it's going to take. So, you know, but obviously maybe the rate that you get the information obviously can perhaps be sped up or slowed down, I guess, which maybe would be the issue with more centralized planned organizations or governments, at least in her view. What do you think?
Well, yeah, it's very interesting trying to pin her down on her like favorability or lack thereof in terms of like the capitalist system and corporations, because it's definitely like, you know, lumping in General Motors with Soviet Union says something about where her politics are, that I think is at odds with some of the other things she says about like free markets, that sort of stuff. But I guess in terms of the systems thinking, my read on this is that she would say that a more distributed
or decentralized, maybe.
Exactly, decentralized, more localized, and distributed across the network level of control is in general better for systems. And I guess the reason for that, right, or if you're trying to steelman that or something like that, is that if you have one central hub that is concerned with the power generation for the whole nation, that's a very different
Right.
and perhaps less flexible goal than if you break that down to 100 different regions, and each region
Right.
recognizes like, oh, like, we get all this sun, so we're going to build solar panels. The other one says, well, we have
Right.
access to geothermal vents, so we're going to build geothermal energy
Right.
acquisition plants. And so by distributing that out to each individual area, you get like a more efficient way of
Yeah.
figuring out what is the best way to acquire energy and how much they need there, rather than centralizing it comes with like more issues because you need more information, right? And again, it's not really necessarily the information that's a problem, but then it's like the build out of changing the
delay,
system to
yeah.
adjust to that information. And then as that, if you're dealing with all those different nodes, right, from one central position, then you have a lot of different information that probably at times contradictory. What one region will need relative to another region might be
Or
contradictory.
competes.
Was that or in
Or
competition?
competes.
Right, yeah.
Right? Because like I feel like, and I could see this especially for thinking like in energy terms, or maybe even a lot of other types of things. If you're making decisions at like the hub of like a nation state, invariably it's probably difficult for the system as a whole to address all of the problems at once simultaneously everywhere, right? So almost inevitably it feels like there's probably some prioritization that would have to come in, which you could obviously see how that might lead to, like, if we're going to stick with the Soviet Union, Moscow might get the new power plant before Siberia
Sure,
does, or whatever, right? Whereas, like, I guess if you do think in terms of like decentralizing and making things like more local, well, if you need more energy in Siberia, well, then you go up ahead and just figure out how to do that there. Like, you don't have to like think in terms of, well, do we do Moscow first, or do we do us first, or somebody else, or whatever. You can just go ahead and deal with the problem that you have at hand in a probably a more timely fashion. I feel like to some degree, I feel like some of this maybe supports well what Richard Wolff and his ideas with like the WSDEs, the worker self-directed enterprises. When you make things more local and you create the concerns that are more like limited, I guess, in scope, it does, like, then you can just deal with the problems that you have at hand,
right.
And there's not as much delay because you don't have to like send the information. Obviously, information can be sent a lot quicker today, but still, necessarily, if you're thinking on terms of a large nation state, especially something like Russia, there's still going to be some amount of like time of like everybody. If you got one guy in the Politburo that's reading, the reports that are compiled from all around the country, well, that still takes time, right? Because there's somebody else has to sign off on things. Whereas if like someone local, instead of having to compile a report to send off to somebody else who then makes the decision, you can just make the decisions, on that local level as soon as you get that information. So it definitely cuts out a few kind of like middlemen and stuff like that. I could definitely see that being useful.
Yeah, and tell me if this is. I don't think it's in this section. I think it might be in her discussion of negative feedback loops, that leverage point. But at some point, she brings up the question of like, well, hey, wouldn't it be crazy if your municipality, any outflow pipes of wastewater that go into the river, you have to put them upstream of any of your pipes that are inflow that take water in to be potable, right? So that, and I think it comes a little bit later when she mentions this, but that kind of ties directly in here, right? Which is the shorter amount of time you can give to an action, and then when the consequences of those actions are then observed, right? Then presumably the better information you're working with, and the better you can make decisions that will then foreclose those potential consequences.
Well,
And,
and especially in some ways tying just the consequences directly to
right,
the people like actually impacted, right? Because that's been like the class. This is kind of something again. Wolf goes at a
right,
lot. If you have somebody that owns like a factory, but they live 1,000 miles away, what do they care if the local groundwater is getting polluted or whatever? But if everybody that's working, owning, operating this factory or whatever also has to live in the area and drink the water, then necessarily they're going to have more vested interest, more of a stake in the game to not pollute their own drinking water, right?
exactly. Yeah. So
So I
I
think there's
wonder
something to
if
that as well.
yeah, yeah, and I wonder if there was any sort of like cross pollination between Wolf and Meadows on that point, because those are like two very similar points, right? That seem
Yeah.
to end up with the same outcome. And so in his worker self-directed enterprises, Wolf's worker self-directed enterprises, I think one of the strongest points in their favor is that idea of like, well, all these
Yeah.
consequences that we see of the capitalist economy, things like climate change or usage of ecological resources, overdevelopment, all those sorts of things, those perhaps could be handled before they become a problem just by localizing the decision making
Yeah.
to where the consequences
Yeah.
are going to occur. And just like you said,
Right.
if everyone, or I guess just like Donella Meadows is saying, right? If we're centralizing the decision-making making processes to Washington D.C. or to the CEO suite for General Motors, then they don't have to deal with
Right.
those consequences, and they can make these decisions
Yeah.
in a vacuum from those consequences.
Right.
So the closer you
Yeah.
can distribute the decision-making to where the actual consequences and the uses of resources and the actual work is
Yeah.
going to be done, you can make that decision-making reflect all of those things. And I
Those
guess
needs.
in
Yeah.
her mind, that would make for a more efficient system in many ways.
Yeah. And I guess where I would push back on like maybe going completely that route, there does seem to me to be some usefulness in also having perhaps more like larger governing bodies or things that maybe can like set like kind of the goals and have like a lot of information at their fingertips to like know like, oh, we do really need to invest in this or that or whatever, because that's obviously I sometimes would see the opposite outcome. Sometimes if you're operating on too small of a level, you might not be aware of enough things and in some ways that might impact those local decisions as well. Like so you might need a bit of a blend here
Right.
between
And
some like central oversight and local enforcement or implementation or however we want to think about it.
right, yeah. And much of the efficiency or capacity or efficacy of like the modern global economy is that we can distribute the acquisition of resources and the vertical pipelining of getting resources to make products across a diversity of people, some of which are exploited, other of which are gaining the wealth from that exploitation.
Yeah.
But also like across different landscapes that have like different resources that aren't available everywhere, right? So I guess if we went back to like your Russia analogy, where like Moscow being the center of the government is probably going to decide to put the power plant first in Moscow, right,
Right.
and not
Right.
necessarily care about the concern of the folks out in Siberia. However,
Yeah.
if you have resources out in Siberia that you cannot find at the large population centers, it would behoove you to
Right.
put some amount of resources out in that direction to acquire those, right? So you do kind of require
Right.
some sort of a larger governing body, or at least some sort of
Yeah.
collaborative organization.
Big picture.
Yeah, exactly. That can look
Yeah.
in the big picture and perhaps use
Yeah.
resources more efficiently than any more granular local organization would be able to do on their own, just with their local resources.
Yeah, it seems like I definitely like the idea of decentralizing and localizing for like a lot of reasons. Like mostly the fact that like I feel like ultimately the people that live in an area are going to care the most about that area and what ends up happening to their area. But it does also feel like there should be some oversight or centralized like goal making or planning or something to that were kind of, you could maybe blend the best of both and maybe leave out the worst of, you know, going completely decentralized or completely centralized.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's clearly a spectrum there, right? And I think probably the Soviet Union would be like in most folks' minds at least, like the epitome of the fully centralized planning, right? And clearly that
Right.
doesn't work out very well because the amount of like attention that you can provide to all the aspects of the system is limited
Right.
when you have
Right.
only a few people or a tiny hub thinking about all the different aspects of the
Yeah.
system, right? However, if you think about like, if you rewind back to 100,000 years ago when humans were exclusively hunter-gatherers, and there was
Right.
no centralized planning going on whatsoever, they probably couldn't
Right.
accomplish getting to the moon, which may or may not be
Right.
worthwhile depending on what your perspective is
Right.
on a great many of things. But it certainly wouldn't
Yeah.
be possible, right, with that level
Right.
of organization. So somewhere in the
Right.
middle, there has to be some sort of a middle ground
Right.
where there's enough central planning to accomplish like a progress that
Things.
aligns
Yeah.
with goals that we
Right.
intentionally are pursuing, rather than just
Yeah.
just cost cutting and efficiency and profit
Right.
maximization, right? But once you have goals in mind, and you have some amount of central planning, that can be powerful to allocate resources appropriately to make sure that you're pursuing those goals in a way that the localized entities wouldn't
Right.
be able to do, right? But then distributing
Yeah.
some of that decision making
Right.
at the more granular level, so that it doesn't get you don't get bogged down by the bureaucracy of centralized planning.
Yeah. Yeah, in some ways, I'm also reminded a bit of like how the Roman Empire more or less functioned at its height, was that there were these like regional governors that were sent out to all of these individual kind of um, states or regions or, territories, or however you want to think about them exactly, provinces. And then they had quite a bit of autonomy at that level to basically do things as they saw fit and as they thought would, best benefit, probably the empire as a whole. But certainly some of that obviously was also meant to make things run smoother for the people living in the province or whatever, too. But then they also did inform, the emperor, obviously, of kind of how things were going. And I guess probably to some of that was making sure that what they were doing in the provinces was still like lining up ultimately with like kind of Rome's overall objectives and all of that. But there was like a sense of, we need someone out on the ground. And of course, this was in a time period where, again, information, even with, the Roman roads and stuff, their system wasn't as sophisticated even as what the Persians had in place, who were really ahead of things. Things could obviously take, a couple of months to travel by ship, from, the Eastern Mediterranean, like back to Rome or whatever. So there was going to be more of a delay, which is also part of why I think historically you probably had to have almost inevitably things a little bit more localized, just because right. You can't wait for, if the barbarians are coming into town, you don't have 2 or 3 months to wait to find out what the emperor wants you to do about it. You know what I mean? Like, you won't be there. Like,
you gotta take action.
Like yeah, exactly. You have to do. He's gonna get a very much a report after the the fact kind of thing. So, obviously, I think, and that was maybe also in part why centralized states, especially as we think of them today, are really a much more recent phenomenon in many ways, because of just the difficulty, quite frankly, of getting information back and forth. And so, really, like, what the last like few hundred years have kind of really seen what we think of as more the rise of the much more modern nation state
rather than a city state, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Geography, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that some of that wasn't even probably truly possible in the same way that it is now, because we do have so much, faster communication. I mean, obviously you started to get things like the telegraph and the telephone and things like that, right? That obviously sped up now the speed of information in a way that had never really been possible prior,
You're instantaneous, yeah.
Yeah, and so it is quite fascinating in a lot of ways to think about that. But even though that now oftentimes the information is not really slowed down so much, there's still, if you have to have like a committee that then discusses the information and decides what to do about it, there could be a delay, whether that's a board of directors or the Politburo or whatever. And then obviously then there's also just this still amount of time that's required to just build the new power plant or whatever it is that has to be done. And those things typically are not going to be able to be done like overnight. And so there's always going to be a bit of this imbalance um, with this kind of information travel, and then like what do we do about it?
Right, right. And so what's interesting to me is that it's very clear that long delays in information or long delays in system change relative to the information is problematic, right? Just because in terms of planning, again, if you go back to the shower analogy, if you turn it to warm and it takes 1 minute for you to get the scalding hot water, then you're going to turn it back
Yeah.
immediately to the cold, and then you don't really know where on the cold that's going to be until a minute later, and that's going to
Yeah.
cause that oscillations where you're
Yeah.
never really going to enter into that
Find the
correct
sweet
temperature,
spot.
right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to be very hard. It's going to take a lot of different yeah, a lot. You're going to take many oscillations to get to that point, right? And you're going to be like feeling
Right.
around in the dark in terms of where on that dial is good until you have gone through a lot of different oscillations to figure out, oh, this is way too hot, this is way too cold, and then eventually come upon that middle point.
Yeah.
But she also says that delays that are too short can cause overreaction, or she puts in quotes, chasing your tail, oscillations that are amplified by the jumpiness of the response.
Right.
And she doesn't really offer any examples for that, but this is going to. I don't have a great framework for how to explain this example, but I feel like maybe we could discuss that. I think social media is probably an example of this, where the now used to be that the way that you acquired information was through the newspaper, which is there necessarily has to be delay that's printed at a specific point in time. It can only
Yeah.
be based on information that occurred in the past, right? And then you get
Right.
it the following day, kind of at best, right?
Right.
And now we have all this information that we're being flooded with that we get immediately at the time of,
Right.
but now it's difficult to sift through what is meaningful information and what is not. So when you
Yeah.
have access to an almost infinite amount of information immediately after it occurs, now there's the problem of what do we do with this information? And that will require a lot of deliberation that either the system may not have capacity to do, like we see many of us modern citizens don't have a great framework to deal with all this information and then come up with a viable or reasonable political response to all of it. And so we end up
Yeah.
with that polarization aspect we've been seeing the last few decades, right? And perhaps that's kind of what she was saying with the oscillations amplified by the jumpiness of the response, that as we get all this additional information and keep getting pumped into us, that's how we get this polarization where the two political extremes keep moving further and further away because we have all that extra information bouncing us back and forth between those two extremes. I don't know if that's a great example.
And I'm also thinking too that like part of it is a lot of those things, because the extremes obviously keep the algorithms engaged or keep people engaged with the algorithms more and things like that. So it also encourages us to go from like one fear mongering thing kind of to the next.
Yep.
So, and perhaps oftentimes maybe like how the clip or whatever is designed might not truly reflect the nature of reality, but it's built to prey on our fear. And so sometimes perhaps doing something might actually be worse than doing nothing and just letting things kind of play out. And maybe I'm trying to think, there was something with the Great Recession in '08. I'm thinking back to that podcast we watched with Tucker Carlson and Sachs, Jeffrey Sachs.
Yep.
Where he was basically, I can't remember if he was saying that like essentially the guy running the Fed like kind of like overreacted or something, and that's like what ended up like actually causing This is going back a little ways. I might be getting that
Right.
wrong. Um,
Right.
but there is like I think sometimes where like if you like almost overreact, you might actually signal to everybody else that the market is in like really dire straits compared to like maybe if you took a more balanced sort of approach to it, which then actually kicks off like a fear spiral where then now everybody is like, oh shit, this is like really bad, like we need to dump everything, and then
Yeah.
of course that just
I mean that's a
causes
really
like a
good
complete
example,
collapse.
right? I think of this like too quick of an information delay, where he had that information, then immediately made an action on it. Everyone else saw that action as
Yep,
information, and then defined their actions based off of that. And
based
if
on
he
that.
had
Yeah,
just holstered it for a little bit longer and not allowed that
right.
information to get out, if there's a delay there, then perhaps it could have
Yeah,
been weathered in a different manner. I forget the exact
yeah,
mechanism for why he was too
yeah,
jumpy, um,
yeah.
in that
I
example as
don't
well,
either,
nearly
but
crash. But that would be a good
yeah,
example, yeah.
yeah. Where like sometimes I don't remember if she says that in. Yeah, she says here there's more leverage in slowing the system down
Yeah.
sometimes than like speeding it up because you don't actually then get quite the crazy uh, like oscillations as much.
Well, I think that she was also that was also framed as, no matter what you want to do, whether it's gaining more information, either if it's a slower rate or a quicker rate that would be more useful. Generally, the quicker rate isn't easy to do. Slowing it down is easier to
Right.
do, right? Taking
That's right.
information
That's true.
and
Yeah.
delaying the dissemination of that information is something that can be
Yeah.
done, right? However, if you don't have if you don't have a telegram or a telephone, you can't relay information instantaneously, right? If we go back to
Right.
1500, there's no way to speed up the relay of
Right.
information. So generally, slowing it
Right.
down is possible, and so that's why that is something that
Right.
can be done. But speeding it up generally is not something that you can just do on a whim, right? Something that
Right. Yeah. She also this almost seems like a tautology in some ways, but she says things take as long as they take,
fair
and
enough. Yeah.
so there's just like this sense that like the building like of the new power plant or whatever. Um, yeah, she says you can't do a lot about the construction time of a major piece of capital or the maturation time of a child, right? Like that's yeah, like a baby is going to start as a baby and it's going to take 18 years till they're like an adult. Like you're not going to be able to like change that some way in one way or the other. And she also talks about like the growth rate of a forest. Again, there are
Yep, yep.
just like some things that take a certain amount of time. And so like if you chop all the trees down, it's obviously going to take some amount of time before they grow back and whatever fallout there is from that in the interim you're going to have to deal with, whether that's a lack of having any wood to build anything, whether that's the soil starts to, get swept away by rain or wind or whatever
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
because there aren't the roots like holding it in place. Um, it's actually something that some early civilizations ran into. I think you probably remember this. He talked about this in that Fall of Civilizations episode about like ancient Sumer, and it was in like the Against the Grain book and some of those
Mm-hmm.
books we read about like that early on stuff. That some of those early like city states kind of fucked themselves because they just went nuts with like building everything and they chopped down all the forests near them, and then basically they were left with like, well, one, they had to start importing wood from like much further away now because the nearby forests were gone, but then also there were like the ecological impacts that came like locally on the nearby level because well, now you didn't have the forests to do what forests need to do. And so, it led to, things like the degradation of agricultural land and things like that too, because topsoil started blowing away and all this kind of thing.
Yeah,
So,
and that
um,
I think directly corresponds to what she says in the second to last paragraph here, which is following up on the slowing things down is generally easier to do. She says, and that's why slowing economic growth is a greater leverage point in Forrester's world
yeah,
model than faster technological development or freer market prices. Obviously, faster
yeah,
technological development is probably something how much, what leverage do you really pull to speed that up, right?
Right.
And for your market prices. Surprisingly, again, she's like, sometimes she's free market, sometimes she's not. So
Right.
very interesting.
Yeah.
But okay, so she says slowing economic growth is better than that as a greater leverage point. Those are attempts, those being the faster technological development and freer market prices, they're attempts to speed up the rate of adjustment.
Speed up,
But the
yeah.
world's physical capital plant, its factories and boilers, the concrete manifestations of its working technologies can only change so fast, even in the face of new prices or new ideas. And prices and ideas don't
Right.
change instantly either, not through a whole global culture.
Yeah.
So there's more leverage in slowing
Yeah.
the system down so technology and prices can keep up with it than there is in wishing the delays away. And, if you think about that, like in terms of like climate change, if technological progress hadn't been so quick in the 20th century, then perhaps our rate of technological development, we would have seen the effects of CO2 transmissions and the impacts on the climate
much slower
before we got so far into our technological development.
Yeah.
Right. And so I guess that's why that's a decent leverage point to her.
And historically, right, like, so the first paper that like mentioned climate change was in like 1913 or something thereabouts, but it was obviously primarily projecting based off of coal.
Yep.
And like those projections were like 1,000 years out because coal was so much like slower to burn I don't know the science exactly, but it doesn't have this nearly the same kind of impact that fossil fuels would come to have. And so you go from like 1,000 years from now to now where we're at like 100 years later, and everything has gone to shit because of like the fact that like we sped up the process of that dumping of CO2 into our system with all the burning of fossil fuels. So it's like there is like that sense that sometimes speeding up the technology is not for the best, actually, when you start to factor in more things into the equation. I mean, I'm thinking now in the present, especially about this new AI drive and all the energy requirements that are coming along with that for this, for these data centers and stuff. Like we're all of a sudden, like we almost like doubled the amount of energy requirements we needed now just to deal with this AI stuff. And now it's like now we're going to be building even more power plants to deal with that. But it's also like, but then we're also currently in this problem of like we can't keep fucking up the environment like we are, and now it's like we just doubled the capacity of like what we're even going to need to sustain us going forward. And it feels like this would be a point if we massively pumped the brakes here and didn't just think that okay, now we just got to go 100 miles an hour on AI might actually be like a good thing, because like again, sometimes speeding everything up is not. Sometimes the climate, especially, cannot handle that kind of speeding up in the way that maybe even economies and some other things can, operate at a little faster frequency and respond to things a little quicker. Environments often cannot.
Right, yeah. Generally, social systems can respond a little bit quicker. They respond to the speed of government or the speed of revolution, right? Whereas the climate biosphere can handle a lot of damage before we observe those ecological impacts. But no matter what, those consequences, whether they're environmental or social or political, those are going to be detached from the actions themselves, right? So the more you can either bridge a connection between them by putting them closer in time or closer in obviousness, closer in explicit connection, right? Then the better, hopefully, your system can handle those. And so just like, as you were saying, the issues with climate change were created not by a slow growth in technology. It really was created by a too quick a pace of technological advance, right? That outpaced our ability to observe the consequences and then socially come up with solutions to deal with those consequences, which we haven't really even gotten there at that point, right? I think we're at least at a relatively global recognition of there are consequences right now. But the general, as she was saying in that paragraph we just read, the general response is that, we just need to accelerate our technology adaptation even quicker so we can technologically solve our way out of this, right? But that's the problem that got us here in the first place. So maybe it's a matter of slowing things down so that our social systems catch up to the damage that our technology is doing before we start, leaning into technological solutions. They're just creating more energy demand, the energy demand of which is the problem that set us off in this path in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like this was not the time to double our energy requirements across the globe.
Right, yeah.
It seems like that was a very bad idea. And so it feels like it just becomes more of a runaway train at some point, because it's like, well, if anything, we're probably going to speed up climate change, if we keep, requiring more and more energy, especially with most of that energy still not being clean energy.
Right.
Too. So, and I mean, even if, like, in best case scenario, if all of the new energy being built moving forward from this point in time, which it isn't because of Trump, or at least he reversed a lot of the things that were at least taking us in the right direction, even if, like, all of the new energy going forward was green energy, there still is going to be some amount of carbon that's going to be required in, transporting the solar panels and all of these, like, other things, obviously, are still going to require the, the energy that we currently have even to build those. So it's like, even at there'll maybe come a point in time if the whole world was on green energy, maybe, we wouldn't be burning so much fossil fuels. Maybe we wouldn't really be contributing more to the problem. But unfortunately, we have to contribute more to the problem in order to even get to the cleaner energy future, because everything has to be, trucked somewhere, or, whatever.
The excavation of rare metals that are used in the batteries and electronics require, machinery there runs only on carbon sources, fuel sources.
On fossil fuels. So there's kind of this whole problem. And then she kind of finishes this section up by saying, if there is a delay in your system, it can be changed. Changing it can have big effects. Watch out. Be sure you change it in the right direction, because like that can also be the thing. She actually also, I think she might go into this a little bit more in another section, but she brings up, or maybe she went into it in the past, but she was talking about how, like, basically the fact that when we sped up, like, how fast money can be transferred, that basically that means financial markets now can be, like, subject to really wild, like, gyrations and fluctuations, because, like just go back to the stock market, if with, like, a click on a button on my computer, I can, like, almost I know there's, like, caps and stuff to some degree on, like, how much of a stock you can sell at once and whatever, but on the whole, if, like, everybody sitting at their computer finds out the stock market is dipping, and we can all push buttons and immediately sell all of our stocks or whatever, right? That's going to cause
you don't have to make a bank run
swing
physically, like in the Great Depression anymore, right? You could just everyone could just do it instantaneously.
Yeah, click.
Yeah, the
on
lower
your phone,
cost
maybe
there is to getting in on that gyration, then the more you're going to get those oscillations, and sharper ones of them,
And so it's like an interesting thing that sometimes speeding up certain things maybe isn't, like, obviously it can be good in certain instances, like you can pay your buddy back faster or something if he laid out the money, like, up front or something or whatever, as opposed to having to, like, mail him a check or whatever. But there is also the chance, we can just do this immediately. There's also probably less time for, like, reflection there, right? Like, if I had to, in the past, if I had to go down to a physical store and write a physical check, or even just pay with a credit card or money in person, but now I can sit in my own home. I don't even have to leave to go, like, I can just buy a lot of shit that maybe...
One-click shipping.
Yeah.
One-click
and so it's like we end up buying a lot of shit probably that ultimately we don't even need, because we didn't really think it through. There was no real cost involved in...
But that's okay, because then you could just bring it to Whole Foods, and you can send it right back to Bezos. So now we have all this shipping going to the house, going back to the place. It's completely unnecessary, because we haven't thought through any of these purchases. Because we just have access to immediate purchasing when we're just sitting there on our smartphone while watching the season finale to Stranger Things or whatever.
exactly. So it's like, there probably is in some ways something to be said for often delaying decisions, whether that's purchasing
Right.
stuff or whatever, just a little bit more because you have a little bit of time to think, oh, do I actually, if you have to even drive 30 minutes to go get something, you're probably going to think about it for, because that's a larger time investment
Right.
for
You're going
you
to holster that till,
versus,
like, you do that
yeah,
once a month rather than,
right.
whenever you have your smartphone out.
Yeah,
So yeah, you're going to have
exactly.
put more
And
reflection in
like,
that purchase.
obviously, we all like the convenience, and there are times when it is nice. I mean, I wanted to like start brewing my own sweet tea again, and so like I ordered a sweet tea pitcher that I can keep in the fridge, on Amazon. It's gonna be here today. It's sometimes it's nice, you get things, like quicker and it's convenient and stuff. But there are also times when you probably end up buying unnecessary shit or
Right. That's
whatever
ultimately,
too.
there's a cost there, right? And so, like, if you're going to make all of your like, as soon as you have a desire, you can quickly follow that up with a purchase, right? The delay is very
Yeah,
short. Then most of your desires are not going to yield meaningful and long lasting outcomes, right? So you may be drinking
yeah,
sweet tea for the next decade, right? And so that purchase was a good
yeah,
one. However, the other
yeah,
90% of your purchases might be more
yeah,
spontaneous and less well thought out, and end up,
yeah,
just resulting in you spending money for Jeffrey
yeah,
Bezos in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise
yeah,
if there wasn't that short of a delay. So I guess ultimately,
yeah,
the title that she gives this section, right, is the length of delays relative to the rate of system changes. And so the
yeah,
problem isn't really whether a delay length of delay is like long or short. It's just how well is it comparable to the system change, the rate of system change, right? So if you have a
yeah,
system that changes very slowly, yet your information is very quick, then that's what's going to lead to like
yeah,
oscillations, right? It's the disparity between the delay in
yeah,
information and the actual change to the physical system.
absolutely.
Yeah, and again, I guess that's what leads us to why it's often better to slow things down, because that system
Yeah,
change is relatively immutable, right? It's gonna be difficult to
yeah,
adjust, but the length of delay in information is what you have a much easier
yeah.
control over, right?
Like maybe with the AI stuff, like maybe they would have been better if we decided as like a society as opposed to just one corporation deciding this either and foisting it on the rest of us. If we had more time to discuss it, decide is this really what we want to do as like a society, a nation state, the world, whatever.
Yeah,
We could have taken more time to determine whether that was a good goal to begin with, and if we did determine it was, well, now we also have more time, elapsed to build the new energy facilities or whatever, as opposed to like, no, we're just going for this now, and oh, now we need all this new energy all of a sudden. Like, where are we gonna get that from? And probably pulling it from the existing grid in some ways is going to be the answer until the new plants are like up and running, right? And so that means that there are going to be other things that are going to suffer in the system. And as a general rule, since we are, I think, more centralized than decentralized, generally speaking, in the modern world, uh who are they going to pull the energy from if they need more for the data centers? Well, it's probably going to be the poor people somewhere in some rural community
right. Well,
that,
energy costs are going to increase, right? And that means
and
that
that,
our spending on energy is going to increase. And if you have less of less headroom in your budget, then that's going to impact you more significantly than someone
yeah,
who has more headroom in their budget. So
yeah,
obviously, the power, the data production centers are going to be fine because they're bankrolled by
yep,
big money. The rich are
yep,
going to be fine because they can absorb that impact of increased energy
yep,
costs. It's going to be the poor who, whether intentionally or not, are going to bear the brunt of the
yep,
cost of that.
yep,
That all too quick adoption of this amount of energy production
yep,
for the AI.
yep,
And what's interesting is, so I guess for that one, this almost seems like an issue of not centralized enough planning. Like right now, we're in an arms
right,
race for the creation of AI, superintelligence, whatever you want to call it, right?
Yeah.
And because the U.S. is in competition with China against one another,
Yeah.
they're racing headlong and without much
Yeah.
thought to the consequences or the
Right.
ethics or any other aspects of what's going on
Yeah.
with AI, to be the first ones there, right? And then we'll just figure it out once we get there. But we need to be the first ones there, right? And so it's really the issue here is that there isn't some larger umbrella organization that is
pumping the brakes.
Pumping the brakes and saying like, whoa, everyone's going to slow down on this. We're going to do a thoughtful and well-reasoned commission on what are the consequences here, and then we can reasonably go forward, either individually or collaboratively to figure out this AI situation.
Yeah. And I would almost maybe call that a lack of a democratized central planning, because it's inevitably it's like the billionaires that own these companies that make most of these decisions, and then of course they control the politicians to basically enact what they want, as opposed to the actual concerns of the people in all these communities across the planet that are going to be impacted and probably impacted negatively by a lot of this. And it's like, we don't get the say. We don't get to be like, well, wait a minute. We didn't ask for our energy needs to double and for, that to do whatever it does to climate change, and perhaps mean that in the, short term, it's going to be the poor people that aren't near the data centers that are going to get their energy, or maybe the poor people living near the data centers, they're going to pull all their energy to the data centers, and everybody else, go fuck yourself. And so it's almost in some ways, which again is why I have an issue with a completely free market idea where, any individual company or something can just do something that then impacts everybody, but they're not beholden to everybody because it's not democratic.
Yeah, and I think she definitely talks a bit about that. Well, I'm sure we'll talk more when we get to the positive feedback loops.
Yeah.
And I had something, but I lost it.
Yeah, that's probably.
One thing I just wanted to say is that
wrap us up, Ryan.
Yeah, that as you said with the democratized decision making here, we see in many of these democracies that although the intent of the system is that the will of the broader people is projected through the government, instead the decision making again is dislocated from that intent, right?
Yeah.
So like you were saying, it is the billionaires and their lobbyists who are influencing the politicians in a way that is disproportionate to the number of billionaires versus the number of people that exist in that nation state, right, or that organization.
Yeah.
And so there's the way that system is set up, the information of the people is not really influencing the decisions of the government itself, right? It's the the information of the few and of the money, the capital that is influencing that. Yeah. So eventually we'll talk about goals of systems, and those are important for us to fit. That obviously is a higher leverage point and helps us figure out, well, where do we want the information to be coming from? What sort of delay do we want it to have? And what impact do we want it to have from each sector of the components of these systems, right? So
it's why often the when you look at polling things and stuff, that often there's quite amount of consensus on a lot of issues with the overwhelming majority of many modern populations, but those desires are often not reflected in the policies pursued by governments because they listen to money. And so it's the interest of only a few is really taken into account.
Yeah. And if your election cycle is only 2 or 4 years, right, and then most of these larger projects or economic changes take longer periods, let's say a decade, to see the consequences of, either those consequences are bad or good, then we end up with that delay in system change relative to our political change. We end up with these oscillations. We're just much more likely for the incumbent to get booted out and then other parties to step in, whether or not those policies will be, will end up good in the end or bad in the end.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
Yeah, exactly. We almost change over the politics too quickly before a lot of the policies that are implemented can even really have taken much like long-term effect, which is I think why she says that like things like budgets and how much we fund this or that aren't really very effective leverage points because they can be changed so quickly.
Yeah.
And like some of these things you almost need like we need to like wait 10 years to see how this plays out, but when the next guy comes in 4 years and undoes it all, well, we didn't even get a chance to see if it worked, kind of thing.
Right. Which I think is like one of the intent behind the what do they do in Congress where they keep things, where they prevent a bill from going forward unless it's like 60% of the majority.
Oh, like the filibuster?
Yeah. Part of the intent behind the filibuster, right? They're like, it doesn't just take a majority, a swing of the parties in order to make a large change, right? You actually need like some collaboration between the parties. And through that, you get to like a more average desire between those two parties, rather than just the whim of one party when they're in charge, then we swing over to the whim of the other party when they're in charge, then back and forth.
Right.
So you need something in the middle that will then be more consistent over time, since both parties agree on it better. So there are ways to put that sort of delay in the system and make it harder to make changes in order to delay that system change to keep up with the rate of actual material change within that system.
Right.
And I guess the better those can be in sync, then the better. But again, the reason why this is so low on the list, not even coming in towards the middle, is because she says that basically the best you can do is kind of slow things down, which may or may not be a good thing. But it's a low leverage point because you don't have that great of a capacity to really influence it all that much.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So our next one that we'll talk about is leverage point number 8. It's the strength of negative feedback loops, and we'll discuss that next video.
Yep. Sounds good.
Cool.
Have a good one.